Hello, welcome back to Psychology of Games. I'm Dr. Spencer Campbell. Today I'm here to talk to you about your problems. And I know coming from a psychologist, there are certain implications when a psychologist says they want to talk about your problems. But I don't mean it like that. I want to talk about problems in your game. And even then, I don't mean like problematic players that you might have or a GM who's got like control issues. I want to talk about problem solving. And this is going to be the first of a three-part series on problem solving. Today, we're going to talk about decision making from a sort of cognitive theory perspective. How do we make decisions on a day to day basis, fast decisions, slow decisions, those sorts of things, and how that's related to our games. Then, next time, we're going to talk about two different types of problems, what we call well defined and ill defined problems, and these sort of strategies and techniques that we use to approach those types of problems. Lastly, the third video is going to be saying, okay, well, now that we know about decision making, now that we know a little bit more about how problems are structured and how we solve them, how can you use that to improve the way that you create problems in your own games for your players to deal with? Or if you're a player and you're watching this, how can you approach future problems that you deal with in games so that it's an entertaining situation for both your fellow players and your GM? So we should probably start off by talking about what a problem is. And like I said, this first video is going to be about decision making. So whenever we talk about decision making, we basically just mean you're moving towards a goal. You have some ideal state in your mind, some place you'd like to be. Sometimes that's literally a new place you want to be. Oftentimes we mean a new state of being. You're trapped in a prison cell, you want to be out of the prison cell. Or you're negotiating with the merchant and you want a cheaper deal on whatever it is you're buying. The ideal state for you is walking away with that item with having paid less money. Fighting a monster? Well, the goal is pretty simple. Kill that monster. At least that's how a lot of games will approach this sort of thing. So if that's decision making, what do I mean by problem solving? Problem solving is a sort of subspecies of decision making. The only difference between problem solving and decision making is that in problem solving, there's an obvious obstacle between you and your goal, something that you need to overcome, a hurdle of some sorts. Sometimes it's literally a hurdle that you need to overcome. Sometimes it is, in a social situation, the navigation of things like social norms, values, and mores. When I talk about problems, I mentioned earlier this idea about well-defined and ill-defined problems. And I want to start off with the definition of well-defined problems because it's going to be helpful for how we think about decision making today. So, a well defined problem is probably the thing that we're most familiar with, or at least the thing that we can point to the most and say, that's a problem, and I know how to solve it. Well defined problems are those things where we have very clear rules and a clear goal, meaning we're constrained. There's a box, and we know that we can work inside this box and eventually solve the problem. Many times they're sequential too. There are steps, and it's an obvious order of steps that you can follow. A Sudoku puzzle is the perfect example of this, right? A Sudoku puzzle has very clear rules to it. You have to go 1 through 9 in each row and 1 through 9 in each column, and then each of one of those little 3x3 boxes also has 1 through 9. Once you learn the logic of it, following the sequence of solving a Sudoku puzzle is, well, it becomes kind of second nature, just like with a Rubik's Cube. Rubik's Cubes are sequential in how you solve them. It's simply a matter of figuring out the pattern. So we want to keep that in mind, these ideas of well-defined problems, the problems that we know what the rules are. We know our sort of limitations of what we can do when we think about decision making today. Because when we think about problems in games, well, we have to think about what do the rules let us do, right? We sit inside a rule book oftentimes. Depending on your game that you're playing, those rules can be more constraining than others. So today we're going to work under the assumption that you're playing a game that has at least some semblance of rules for making decisions and problem solving rather than being something entirely improvisational. When we talk about decision making from a cognitive perspective, we're talking about a 5-step process. At least that's what Gila put forth in 2002. And still today, we mostly think of this as it's probably the most likely way that we make our decisions. It's a very effortful process and it's very time consuming. And I want us to keep that in the back of our minds when we think about each of these steps, because it's 5 steps. And when we usually think about making a decision, we think it's a 1-step thing. I make the decision and then I move on. But in our well-constrained, well-defined situations, we might actually end up going through 5 different steps. We're just not necessarily aware of us going through each of these steps. Before we talk about the model, let's imagine a scenario. You're playing a role-playing game, and an ally of you in the party, you have an ally, and they've been framed for a crime that they didn't commit. They're about to be put forth in front of the queen, and she's going to judge your ally. And she's probably going to judge guilty because they've been framed, right? You all want to do something about this, but the question is, what do you want to do, or what will you do? Now it's decision making time. And now you're probably already imagining what this is like when you're at your own table, right? Every table is going to have its own dynamics in terms of how they approach something like this. And then every game is going to allow you to do different things. Let's talk about Galati's 5 steps and how that might manifest in different types of games. The first thing is to set a goal. Again, when I talk about goals, I'm talking about an ideal state. Decision making is all about moving towards a goal, some sort of desired situation that you'd like to be in. And basically, we judge decisions as good or bad based off of, are you moving closer to your goal, or are you moving further away from it? Well, right now, our goal is probably saving our ally, right? What do you all want to do about your ally? If they're really your ally or you care about them enough, then we're going to set a goal of saving them. We know that we can save our ally, but we don't know how we can do it yet. But it's at least we're all on the same page as a table. That's our goal. And that's actually a really important thing. All at the same table, we're all on the same page. A game that allows players to all be on the same page about certain things can be really helpful when we just starting with step 1 of decision making. I think it's really important in a lot of games that we allow our players agency in bringing forth and adding to the story the things that are important to their character. But I think also a good game does that and introduces that in a way that allows everybody to be kind of contributing pieces to the same dish, so that the dishes and the ingredient, when it all gets combined, it's delicious, rather than, well, I like a lot of salt in my dish and this person's throwing some bananas in there, and already we're off to like a weird start, right? So a good game allows us as a table to understand what our goal is in play. Now it's time to gather up some information. A well-defined problem, like I said before, has clear information. It has clear rules that you can sit in. That box is clear. And it has a clear goal that you're going for. So now we got a clear goal. We have clear rules. There's 3 types of information that we're going to go seek out. We're going to think about what our options are, the likelihood of those options, and then also we have to make some rules for how we're going to make our decision. Let's talk about these things in terms of our current situation. What are our options? Well, depending on the game, you might have very few options or a lot of options. For example, a game that allows for social interaction might be allowing then you to convince the queen that your friend isn't guilty, or at least convince them to delay the execution or something like that, right? You can go about a social sort of solution to this. Or you could go with a prison break, right? You could just try and bust your ally out of prison. Or you could show up in court and just start swinging your swords until you solve the problem. There's a lot of different options in front of you. So y'all have to figure out what you could do. Then, once you know what you could do, it's time to do a little bit of statistics. It's time to do a little bit of probability. And this is something that I like to say that we're good and bad at this. Um, our brains are brilliant pattern recognition machines. We're fantastic at noticing and recognizing patterns in the world. But then when it comes time for us to be consciously aware of the patterns in our world, or consciously aware of things like odds, we are not as good at that. You can look at anybody who knows the statistics on things like texting and driving causing accidents versus accidents caused in a plane crash, and you can see that we have total disparities on what people are actually afraid of because they don't understand how statistics work or probabilities work. When we talk about likelihood in a game, we're talking about probabilities, right? It's at least a game that is going to have some sort of chance component to it. So if we're rolling dice or if we're flipping cards or something like that, then we know that it's not just I say it and it happens. I say I do something. Let's see if it actually happens. So when we're thinking about our options here, somebody might say, well, On like speaking related skills, I add 8 to my roll. I'm really good at that. I'm only a +2 when I'm trying to hurt people. So I'm not going to be very good at that. So if we want me to be involved in this solution, I'm going for the speaking thing because I just know from a probabilities perspective, I'm probably going to roll higher then. I'm going to get a higher result. Okay, so we know what our options are. We're starting to think about our character sheets. Like, what are our stats actually allowing us to do? What skills we have, our feats, or depending on whatever your game is. Let's set some rules, though, for making that decision. What are you allowed to do, or at least able to do? Some of that is determined by the fiction, right? Obviously, what you're allowed to do depends on the fictional world that you all have agreed to play in. So, if we're in a fantasy, medieval fantasy setting, and I want to save my ally from being killed by the queen, I can't say I go get my bazooka and blow up the whole court. Everyone at the table is going to look at me and go, Spencer, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't fit this scenario. That's a kind of against the rules, not even necessarily against the rules of the book, but against the rules that we as a table have decided. But then we also have to think about mechanically the rules, what we're able to accomplish. You're eventually in your life going to run into somebody who's like a rules lawyer who's going to be really hard on this third piece of information. But even those who aren't rules lawyers are going to consider, well, what does the game allow us to do? What are the mechanics supporting us? And I think that's really important. Games are designed in such a way that the mechanics are pushing us towards certain play styles. The games are designed that way. Dungeons and Dragons, for example, is a combat simulator. And we know it's a combat simulator because that's what the rules support, right? There aren't extensive amount of rules in there for court intrigue. If you want to play court intrigue, there's a million other games out there. So we have to think about mechanically what we're constrained in doing, and if the mechanics aren't in place, we either need to think about a new game or rather than just throw everything away, how can we house rule the situation? We need to change the criteria. Okay, so we've got a bunch of information. We have a goal in mind. Let's put that information in a useful format for us. We need to organize it somehow. What that means at the table oftentimes means players stating their cases, right? Everybody wants to decide what we're going to do as a party, and so everybody's going to say what they think we should do as a party. I've run into tables that even do things like quite literally writing out pros and cons lists because they find this is an effective way of making a case. And I love that. If that helps you structure your information, that's a great way of doing it. That relieves you of the cognitive load of trying to remember your plan versus your other friend's plan and that person's plan. Now you've got at least all on a page. But we think about this again, going back to the idea of what does the fiction allow, but also now what does the table allow? What do we as a group have made the social contract in terms of making plans? And I think this is really, really important. Think about two totally different games that involve planning in very different ways. Shadowrun. Okay, so Shadowrun, whatever you may think of the setting in the game and everything like that, it's a crunchy system, right? You're rolling fistfuls of dice, and that feels good sometimes. But when you read a whole paragraph in a book that's about treading water, I get that that's not for some people. But Shadowrun's thing is all about planning the run, right? You all are criminals. You want to do a job and you want to do it well. And there's a million different ways that you can approach a given job. And so a typical Shadowrun campaign could spend a session or two just in the planning phase, just figuring out what you all are going to do, structuring this information. That's what the system supports. That system emphasizes step 3 of Galati's model to a great degree. It's all about gathering information by doing some legwork and then structuring it. The decision itself, the run itself, is almost secondary, uh, as opposed to Blades in the Dark. Blades in the Dark is another game that's about doing crime, right? Doing heists and things like that. But in Blades, you don't plan. You're not really supposed to plan. You have an idea of what the job is going to be, and then you roll for an engagement roll, and then you're just in it. After that, you can flashback. You can go back and change the situation, change the fiction. But the way that we structure information in a Blades game as a table is very different than how we structure information as a Shadowrun group. Okay, so let's say you've got your information, you've laid it all out. Let's make a decision. And I say that so casually. It's not always so obvious. It's not always easy to make decisions. Like I said, this is an effortful process that I'm describing. It's a time consuming process. And oftentimes, the information that we gathered is rarely certain, especially when we're dealing with probabilities of things happening, but also just the concept of the GM might know a lot more than you, and the GM hopefully isn't lying to you. I hope you're not working with a GM who's withholding information or giving you bad information. But part of the fun is in the players not knowing what's going to happen and playing to find out. And so, because of that, making the decision is a leap of faith, right? You're kind of hoping that you've structured your information correctly and you make the right decision. I'm going to talk to you about the strategies involved in this step in the part 2 video, because this step is actually much more involved than I'm kind of giving it credit for. But we don't have time in this video to cover the 5-step model and the strategies involved. And wait a minute, didn't I say that this is a 5-step process? But we're at step 4 and we just made a decision. What else could you possibly need to do? Well, the last step is evaluating the decision. We've rolled the dice, we flipped the card, we did the thing, the mechanics have manifested, and now we know what happens. Now we have to ask ourselves, did we make the right decision? In a role playing game, we actually do step 5 a lot more often than we do step 5 in the real world. We go through this 5-step process a lot when we're making decisions, but we oftentimes miss this last step. We don't spend a whole lot of time evaluating our decisions. And as a result, we kind of can get into bad habits about how we make decisions. But in a role playing game, you have an immediate mechanical bit of feedback to you. The dice roll either goes well or it goes poorly. And then the GM says something, right? Then the game changes. And you can immediately know whether or not that was a good decision or a bad decision. At the end of the day, you might have gotten what you wanted, but you might not be happy about the route that you took. For example, we got our friend out of from being executed by the queen, but we pissed off a whole lot of people along the way. We might have gone and done the prison break, but it didn't go so well. We weren't so stealthy. We actually had to hurt some prison guards along the way, and we didn't want to hurt the innocent folks, but we did because we really wanted to get our friend. Now you know in the future that you're not so good at the sneaky stuff. Or if you want to be good at the sneaky stuff, you have to go about it a little bit differently than you did this last time. Either way, the decision that you just made is going to go into your memory. And as a result, it's going to be part of that information gathering, part of that likelihood of outcomes happening section back in step 2 that we talked about earlier. These evaluations are going to matter more or less depending on the game that you're in. If the game that you're in allows things like character growth and character advancement that can fundamentally change the way that you play the game, then this is an important step. More so than I think if you're just getting a stat boost. If you get like a +1 in something, obviously that is going to go back and change the way that, like in step 2, you have the evaluation of the likelihood of things. Your probabilities have increased a little bit. But it's not the same as having a meaningful change in the way that you can quite literally interact with the fiction and in the world around you. So that's Galati's 5-step model. But we're not quite done. I have a little bit more that I want to talk about with decision making, because an important thing to note about this is that all of this is working in a sort of idealized situation. In fact, Galati's model, cognitive models, economic models, mathematical models, philosophical models of decision making, many of these models work under the assumption that we have logical thinkers on our hands, that we have people who are going to take the time to go through all 5 of these steps. That's a huge assumption that you've got time. And when we think about it, that's not necessarily conducive to storytelling or all games. But using the example that I talked about before, some games like Shadowrun, this is absolutely the ideal situation. Galati's model shines in Shadowrun. In Blades in the Dark, it's not quite as useful. We still do many of the steps, and in fact, we might still do all 5 steps, but we burn through them very quickly, as opposed to when we're playing Shadowrun and we take our time with it. So what happens when we burn through things? This is a thing called a heuristic. And I want to talk a little bit about heuristics, and then we'll kind of wrap up this one and start talking about problems next time. Heuristics are shortcuts. They are little shorthand rules that we give ourselves for making decisions fast, quickly. I don't want to say effortlessly, but without having to really think too much about it. This is burning through Galati's 5-step model. In fact, it's not even doing the model at all. It's rules like, if I'm in this situation, I always do blank, right? If I've been caught by a guard, I always attack, right? I don't take the time to try and convince them or sneak away or anything like that. I just attack, right? I had a friend who he his character literally had a warhammer, and he saw the whole world as nails. All he did was swing that hammer anytime he was in a bit of conflict. And you know, it was great because whenever it was his turn, we knew what he was going to do. We moved quickly, and it was effective in a lot of situations, but it wasn't always effective. um, and that's where we see things like the availability bias or availability heuristic coming in and being problematic for us. Availability heuristic is us using kind of the most salient or recent example of something guiding our future decisions. Outside of games, let's say you just watched a horror movie, and you're like me and you're a big coward. Well, at night, when I go to bed and I turn off the lights, you better believe that if I hear a sound in my apartment, I'm pretty convinced that a murderer or a monster is about to kill me, because the most salient thing in my mind is that in a dark, spooky movie, a monster killed people. So, of course, I'm in a dark, spooky situation. I'm going to get killed by a monster. That same thing applies for games. If the last time you approached a particular solution or a particular problem, that solution worked for you, then again, you're going to keep using it and again and again and again because it works, right? And even if it doesn't work, it's worked 9 out of 10 times. So why try and fix what's not necessarily broken? And that can be not so great, right? Because then the play gets kind of boring maybe for you if eventually you're like, oh, this is all I do just every single time. My character isn't able to do more. And then that kind of goes back to this idea of what the game is allowing us to do. If games are pushing us towards using availability heuristics, pushing us towards being in a sort of box, then we're going to be really good when we're in that box. But we might also start to get bored inside that box. Or the second we try and move outside the box, we're punished for it. The game says, well, you're either really bad at that or you can't do that at all. So let's wrap up part one here. What do we know now? We know that problem solving is sort of a subspecies of decision making. We know how decision making works from a cognitive perspective. It can be very effortful, or it could be that sort of quick and dirty heuristic decision making process. So the next two videos are going to be expanding on this idea of a problem solving scenarios in games, the different ways that we can format a problem, and the different ways that ultimately we can solve them, and then ultimately, how can we design interesting problems for our players? So I hope you enjoyed this video on problem solving, the first of the series of 3. I enjoyed talking with you all about it. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Gila RPGs. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you all soon.